Hello to you newcomers and welcome back, my lovely subscribers, to the Galactic Armory. Today I'm going to be showing you guys how to complete your own Kashyyyk Clone Trooper Helmet so that you too can be beheaded by Master Yoda. Now as with all my helmets, this one's going to be 3D printed. Now if you don't have a 3D printer, don't feel discouraged. I do sell the raw 3D prints that we're going to be starting with on my shop online. And if you do have a 3D printer, that's also where you can find the files. So if you want to complete this project while also helping out the channel, be sure and check that out. Now we're going to start working with the 3D files, so if you don't have a 3D printer, check out the timestamp in the description to skip ahead to when we have the physical helmet. With all that said, let's get right into it. So as you can see, I've already got all the pieces separated out. This one actually has some nice tabs that fit the front and the back together. You can see they interlock there and there. The top dome also has an interlocking back tab that fits right into there. And then the visor sits on top of the face. For the slicing, I'm just going to show you guys how I printed the visor since it's one of the trickiest parts. So what we're going to do is we're going to start rotating it a bit to try and flatten out that curve. That's pretty well flat. Now let's go and add our supports. I like to add it for anything greater than a 65-degree overhang. This is Simplify 3D. It added the supports. It added some supports, but we're going to add some more. We want total coverage underneath this visor along the brim. One, it's going to help it adhere better to the print bed, and two, you obviously are going to need some supports under here. Simplify 3D does a pretty good job of getting most of them, but you definitely need to add some in some cases. You're also going to want some supports underneath this little rectangle cutout along the top edge, since that is just kind of free floating in air. Okay, so that's pretty good. Let's slice it and see how it looks. Okay, it says it's going to take 17 hours. And there is something I want to change. So, see this raft? I print all of my helmets with rafts. It helps it adhere to the bed, and I think it helps minimize any bed leveling issues you might have. That said, I want all of the edges touching the build plate to have a raft. So this little overhang over here and down here, that needs to be on a raft. So to do that, we're just going to add some manual support there. Then when we go to reslice this, it should add the raft underneath it. There. Now we've got a raft underneath our total edge. And at only 17 hours, this is not too bad of a print, and definitely one that I would recommend printing in one piece if you can. So now that we've got all the pieces sliced, we can start printing. So all of these parts were printed on a CR10 with white PLA from Xyltech. Now that is where I get all of my filament, so if you guys are in need of filament, I highly recommend them. And you can get 15% off your order by using code Galactic Armory. So be sure and check that out if you need filament. This helmet took around 100 hours to print and used about a full kilogram of filament. Once you have all the pieces of the helmet printed out, we'll need to start assembling it. So for assembly, I've got a few materials. We've got a fast-acting CA glue. We've got some slow-acting but strong bonding E6000. And I've got a soldering iron as backup. Now the tabs on the back of the face should align with the back and give you a good spot to glue. So we're just going to take our CA glue, add a few dabs inside those tabs, and then join the front and the back together. Now what I'll do is I'll grab my soldering iron that I really don't care if it gets dirty or not, and I'll weld the inside seams of the front and the back. This is just going to make sure that it holds it in place while the glue is setting. This step is optional, but it just helps me save some time on waiting for the glue to dry. So after I'm done welding, I'll take my E6000 and apply it to the inside seam as well. This stuff takes about at least 24 hours to fully cure, so it's very slow, but once it does cure, it's pretty strong. So we're going to add this just to make the bond a lot stronger. Now the top dome should fit just on top of the front and the back, and for the dome, since the front and the back are already pretty well secured, I'm just going to sit the dome on top. I don't have to hold it in place or anything, so I'm just going to directly apply the E6000. I'm not going to glue the visor yet. It's going to help us a lot with painting if it's still separate, so we'll be able to reach into those areas around the eyes. So we're going to let this sit for probably 48 hours just to be sure, and then we can start with the smoothing process. So with most FDM printing, you're going to want to fill in the 3D printer lines so that we can get a smooth finish for painting. For that, the product we're going to use first is called Bondo Glazing and Spot Putty. Now when using this stuff, you're going to want to wear some gloves, a respirator, and do it in a well-ventilated area, because this stuff is pretty nasty. What it is, I like to call it a red toothpaste, because that's basically the consistency it has. It was originally made to fill in like deep scratches and stuff in automobiles. So that's where you're going to find this stuff, is in the automobile section of most large retailers. But what it does is that it comes out like the toothpaste, but after about 15 minutes, it will start to react with the air and harden. And after about 6 hours, it'll be completely hardened, and you'll be able to sand it away to reveal a smooth finish. So they use this in car scratches to fill in the scratches and then sand it smooth so that it basically hides the imperfection. We're going to be using it to fill in the 3D printer lines so that we can have a smooth finish for painting. What we're going to do is just squeeze some out of the tube onto the helmet and then rub it in with our gloved finger. We're going to do this basically all the way around the helmet. Then we'll wait for it to harden, and then we'll start sanding. Now I say basically because this is kind of a special case where the visor will actually cover up parts of the helmet, so we don't really need to apply Bondo to those parts. It would just kind of be a waste of material, since it's not going to be visible on the final helmet, and it'll just take up your time and material when it doesn't really have to. So you can see me kind of test fit the visor on there to see what parts don't really need Bondo. Now if you guys have made it this far in the video, I feel like it's pretty safe to say that you're interested in doing a project like this. I just wanted to take a few seconds to encourage you guys, because I strongly believe that anybody could do this. I am not an artist by any means, but 3D printing technology has enabled ordinary people to create great things. I've been doing this for a couple years now, so by making these videos, I hope to enable you guys to make your own helmets. I love seeing photos of your guys' finished helmets. It just goes to prove my point that anybody can do this. So if you're on the fence of ordering a 3D printer or ordering the 3D printed parts, I just want to give you some encouraging words and say that you can do this. So enough motivational talk, let's get back to the build. Once our helmet is fully coated in Bondo, let it cure for about, I don't know, probably a full 8 hours. And then our next step is going to be sanding. Now sanding is going to be the most physically strenuous part of this whole build, so be prepared for that. Some of the materials we're going to be using are a 150 grit pad of sandpaper. I've got some Rust-Oleum filler primer, and you're going to want either a microfiber cloth or something to clean up. You're also definitely going to want to wear a respirator or a dust mask for this, because it is going to make a lot of dust. You can also see that I'm outside because this step is also very messy. So we're going to start off with our 150 grit pad of sandpaper. I just grab off a little square and get to sanding. Then we're going to start with 150 grit because it's a little bit more on the coarse side. This means it's going to do a great job at getting off a lot of the Bondo material. If you used like a 400 grit pad of sandpaper right away, it would take a lot longer to sand the helmet smooth. So we're using something a little bit coarser at first. Just go over the entire helmet, sanding away. Your arm's going to be really tired by the end of it, and just use your microfiber cloth to clean off the Bondo dust. Once you've gone around the entire helmet, wipe it down clean. We're going to want all the dust off the helmet. I like to use a leaf blower just to make this step a little bit quicker. Now that we've got the helmet all sanded, we're going to be using a product called filler primer. Now this filler primer comes in an aerosol can, and it's a bit thicker than most aerosol paints. What it's going to do for us is as we spray it around the helmet, it's going to fill in those very tiny lines that the rough sandpaper left. Like we said, the 150 grit sandpaper is a bit coarse, so this stuff is going to fill in those very tiny scratches that left. What this is also going to do is fill in the 3D printer lines that we couldn't really reach with Bondo. Some of the details around the mouth, for example, I didn't want to put Bondo in there since I knew it would be very difficult to sand. So we're going to be using this filler primer to fill in those lines instead of Bondo. I used to use the filler primer first, like do a couple coats of it, but I find that doing Bondo first and then filler primer saves a lot of material, since I can usually do a helmet now with only 1 can of filler primer, whereas before it was about 2 to 3. So we're going to do a couple of coats on the helmet, waiting about 20 minutes in between each coat, and then we'll be able to move on to the next step. So now our helmet is a lot smoother than it was, but it's still not quite perfect. So what we're going to do is go over the helmet again and apply Bondo in those spots that still need a little work. Maybe we didn't apply enough Bondo in the first place, or we sanded too hard and now the lines are visible again. So we're just going to apply a little bit more Bondo to fill in those spots. So we're back to sanding again, but this time we're going to be using a 400 grit pad of sandpaper instead of a 150. Since we only applied a little bit of Bondo, it shouldn't take that long to finish sanding, and this way it's going to help the helmet feel a lot smoother. After we finish sanding, we're going to apply another coat of filler primer just to kind of cover all our bases to prepare for the final sanding. Again, for the final round of sanding, we're going to use our 400 grit pad of sandpaper just to make sure that we have a smooth surface. Now as you're sanding, you should still be looking for any trouble spots that might need additional Bondo or filler primer. When you're done with this sanding round, you should be completely happy with how the helmet looks. Once we finally got the helmet smooth, we can start on one of my favorite parts, painting. Now the paint job for this helmet was very complicated. It is very difficult to paint a camouflage pattern, and it's not exactly movie accurate, but I'm very happy with how it turned out, since I was trying a new technique. So for the camouflage, I bought 3 different types of camouflage spray paint, one that's pretty light, one that's in the medium, and one that's pretty dark. So for the base coat of paint on the helmet, we're going to apply the lightest coat and then apply the darker coats on top of it. So for the camouflage pattern, I wanted it to be kind of random, but I wanted to do it without taping, just to kind of give it more of a random feel. For that, I thought the best way to do it would be with a sponge. So I went to the grocery store, went to the automotive section, and got one of those great big sponges you use to clean your car. Now in order to get the random paint effect I'm looking for, we're going to rip a chunk off the sponge, and the new edge created should be kind of like textured and random. What we're then going to do is take our darker spray paints and paint the new rough edge, and then just kind of dab it onto the helmet. It's going to leave a little bit of paint behind and a random splotch. At first I tried wiping it, since that seemed to leave more paint, but it wasn't really the effect I was going for, so I started just kind of lightly dabbing it, and that gave me the effect I liked. It doesn't look like much, but once we start doing more coats, add more colors, it's really going to start to look camouflaged. Try not to go overboard with one color in particular, just kind of apply it in random spots all around the helmet. So now that the first coat of all 3 colors is done, we're going to let the paint cure, just so that we can apply more coats and make it look a little bit better. For the second coat of paint, we're going to start with our original base coat, since I feel like that mostly got covered up by the end of the first round. But again, we're just going to go across the entire helmet with all 3 different colors, trying to get it look as random as possible. By the end of it, I was pretty happy with how the design turned out, since this is my first time painting camo. But if you guys have any suggestions or experience with painting camouflage, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Now that we've got our camouflage pattern, we can start to add in some other colors to the helmet. So luckily for us, there's only one other color in this helmet, and that's black. So we're going to be using our thin masking tape to outline the details around the mouth, and then our thicker blue masking tape for coverage. We're just going to cover up most of the rest of the helmet so no stray paint particles land in our camouflage pattern. Now that we've got that sorted, we can add the black paint. I'm going to be using a Rust-Oleum flat black, but basically any basic black will work. You want to do light coats as always, but you want to be sure to get into the corners and the crevices of the helmet, because some of those places might not get paint the first time through. Once your black paint is dried, we get to enjoy the experience of peeling off the tape. Now you want to be gentle, especially with the thin masking tape around the mouth. We don't want to accidentally lift up any details below, but if you do it carefully enough, you shouldn't have a problem. Okay, our helmet is looking more and more finished. We're almost done, just a few more things to go. So to add a bit of realism to the helmet, we're going to be doing some weathering. So the setup here, I've got an airbrush along with some black Spastic high gloss black, and we're going to be using this black paint to airbrush areas around the helmet. Now some areas that I like to pay attention to are the kind of recessed areas where dirt and grime would naturally accumulate. For instance, the areas below the eyes I think would get dirty pretty quickly. Some of the areas around the visor, around the top of the helmet. These are all areas that have hard creases, so they're more likely to collect dirt. You don't want to add too much weathering. You can definitely overdo it at this stage, and I think that I actually did. Part of that is because I was using a new airbrush tip, and it just did not have the same level of control as some of my other airbrush heads, so I accidentally got a lot more paint than I was expecting to come out. So what I ended up doing was just following it up with a little bit more of the sponging technique, using some of our darker paint to just cover up some of the black. That was a bit too much in some areas. But this is going to do a lot to darken the overall look of the helmet, and I like how that turned out. I might go back to just doing a black wash for weathering. That's worked very well for me for a long time. I just recently started trying airbrushing just because I thought it would be fun, but not everybody has an airbrush or has the money to buy one. So might be going back to just the black wash method. So now that we've got our weathered helmet, we need a visor. And I hope you guys are ready to see me struggle because this was a challenge. So first let's go over the materials. Obviously we're gonna need a visor. I just got this visor off of Amazon. I looked up green grinding shield, something like that, and this came up. We're gonna be using some epoxy putty. For that we're gonna need some gloves, and then we've just got a paper and pen. So the first thing we're gonna do is trace out the eye hole on our piece of paper. We're just gonna put the paper on the inside and then trace it with a Sharpie. This will give us a good idea of how much material we're gonna need to cut out for the visor. Now this particular visor is, you can see that it's pre-curved. Normally the visors that I get are flat and flexible. This one is pre-curved, a lot thicker than my other ones, and it is not very flexible at all. You can see I try and realize very quickly I'm not going to be able to cut this with my normal scissors, so I'm going to have to try and cut it with a different tool. So next on the attempt list is a little handsaw. This also was met with failure, so we're going to try something else. So the only thing I was able to find that kind of worked was the snips from my 3D printers, actually. So I slowly snipped around our outline and eventually realized that it was too big to actually really fit in the helmet. So for this helmet, I recommend cutting out a visor that is just barely larger than your outline you traced on paper. Mostly because there's not really a lot of room to the sides of the visor for any extra width. So the visor you cut out is going to have to be pretty close in size to the visor hole. So we're dealing with pretty low tolerances here. If it's not already obvious, I would not really recommend this visor in particular. I'm not going to link it in the description. I had a terrible time with this. I would definitely recommend just maybe looking for a black visor or getting a clear visor in some green tint would work. You can even green tint a black visor if you want. But yeah, just don't use this one because it is a pain to work with. It is way too rigid. Save yourself some time and frustration. Go with something else. So now that we finally got our visor cut out, we can start attaching it to the helmet. Now for that, we're gonna grab our epoxy putty and put on our gloves. Now what this epoxy putty does is it's kind of a tube of Play-Doh material. Now on the outside is a gray material and on the inside is a black material. Now when these two mix, they're gonna start to chemically react. It's gonna give off a lot of heat and it will very quickly turn very hard. So what that's going to do for us is we're going to use it to hold the edges of the visor down inside the helmet, and then when it totally hardens, it will do a great job of holding that visor in place. I had to use quite a bit of putty for this visor. Since it's pre-curved, it really wanted to return to that curve, so I had to use a lot of putty to hold it down. You don't need to use putty around the entirety of the visor. I usually just do it in 4 corners. Most of the time that's enough to hold the visor in place pretty well. You're definitely going to want to wear gloves for this. You know, as you're mixing the black and the gray material together, you just kind of want to make Play-Doh snakes over and over until eventually you kind of have a dark gray material that's a good mixture between them both. And you want to hold the visor in place with your hand for just a couple minutes. You'll start to feel the putty get hard very quickly, but you do need to hold it in place for a few minutes as it's starting to harden. Now at this point I still have the visor unattached from the helmet. You can leave it unattached if you want. I ended up just applying some E6000 to the top and just squishing the visor down on top of it, since this is mostly going to be a display piece. But if you're using it for traveling or something, having that visor be separable might be of worth to you. So now that the putty is decently hard enough, I can remove my hand from it and we can take a look at it. As you can see, it's held in place. I had to use 3 globs of putty, one on the left, right, and the top, and that should hold it in place pretty well. Now the last part of that helmet is the 2 little aerators on the front. we're just going to affix those to the helmet with some E6000. And then I'm going to add some masking tape to them just to hold them in place. Make sure that they don't fall off while the E6000 is curing, since it takes, you know, over a full day to fully cure. So this tape's just going to hold them in place until then. And once that glue cures, our helmet is finally finished. So let's take a look at the final product. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how the helmet turned out. I was a little intimidated at first doing a camouflage pattern, but I think this worked pretty well. If I could, I'd probably change the visor again. You'll see when I put it on, you can still kind of see my eyes through it, which not ideal, since that's not what it's like in the movies. But this is definitely a unique helmet. I love being able to add it to my collection. Even though they were only in the movie for like a few seconds, they're still pretty recognizable. So I hope you guys enjoyed this project. I hope that you learned something and that you're feeling confident enough to take on a project like this yourself. I know it's intimidating at first, but I hope that these tutorials are helpful to you and help you feel confident enough to take on this challenge. Remember, I do sell the files and the raw 3D prints that we started with on my shop. If the prints are sold out, I do have a new feature on my site where you can sign up for email notifications when they come back in stock. I'm trying to relist as many helmets as I can for you guys, so I appreciate you guys' patience. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you guys again in the next one.